Welcome to the Muslim blog. When we talk about anything though, I wonder if we care about whether or not we talk about things we cannot see though. Like, we live in a type of environment where there are tiny particles, exactly. But when we talk about that though, it has to do with whether we know things exist even. But most of the time when persons talk about whether things exist, it has to do with whether they understand that before that some people didn't know about any number of topics and everything. But anyway, this is a discussion people can talk about, but only talking about things at the subatomic level and things like that. But who cares about that type of discussion? What I tell persons is something very basic. There's tiny particles that we can't see, exactly. When we talk about those type of topics though, it has to do with anyone cares about that though. Like, if an individual talks about nearly any topic, like, we don't know these things, but what I try to tell persons about a topic is something very basic though. The type of discussions that focus on things that no one cares about are that when we look at the human being, exactly. If someone is part of when we talk about nearly any topic though, it's whether or not we're playing coy with that in that sense. But let's say, for example, if we do talk about a topic, what about the unseen portion of practically everything, right? Like, if persons are talking about nearly any subject, it has to do with things that exist in terms of, like, tiny particles and everything. But if we look at anything in particular, though, persons can talk about their own topics. But why do I end with this? Well, it has to do with that, right? Like, when persons are focusing on things, it has to do with things we have no idea of, right? Like, a person has to accept that there are things that they just do not know. In that sense, though, another way of making that type of statement is whether a person just finally accepts there's things they can't see even. Like, when we look at it from that level, it seems easier, right? But it's better to say there are things we don't know. But a person can be at a lesser level where the person can even say there are things we cannot see. In that sense, let me know if persons can get to that level. Like, when persons are talking about nearly any topic, it has to do with accepting that fact. There are things we cannot see. In that sense, though, if the person says about different topics, though, a person can say there are things we cannot know. But when we talk about cannot know, for me, before you get to that level, it has to do with accepting there are things we cannot see. If the person understands any topic, though, the person has to understand there could be a being sitting right next to me, exactly. Thankfully, it's an angel, exactly. In that sense, though, why would something like that be anything different? A person has to accept, though, there are things we cannot see. If a person then says there's things we cannot know, to me that type of evolution makes sense. But if the person cannot accept a basic principle like that and jumps to there are things we cannot, exactly, but what I try to tell the persons are that when someone talks about nearly any topic, the standard has to be there are things we cannot see. That has to be the first standard, exactly. If there are any number of topics, so the standard has to be there are things we cannot see. In that sense, though, if the person is talking about nearly any topic, it has to do with whether people care about that, though. If there is a being sitting there, exactly, but what I try to tell persons about that topic is that, though, when a person is talking about nearly any subject, it has to do with basic standards like that, though. Like, when persons are nearly any subject, it has to do with a big, vast topic. No, it has to do with someone jumping to there are things we cannot know. That is perfectly legitimate, but what I try to tell persons about the appropriate standard has to be there are things we cannot see. When a person is able to say that first, then the next evolution is to say there are things we cannot know. In that sense, though, there are things we cannot see. When we look at it from that level, it could be as numerous as things we don't know, right? But when persons are talking about nearly any topic, though, when persons say, well, things we cannot see is part of things we cannot know, to me, it has to do with the first standard, exactly. In that sense, though, if we say the first standard is there are things we cannot see, then a person can understand practically any topic. Persons can say, if I were to be in any kind of situation, it makes sense, exactly. But when persons are talking about any number of topics, though, it usually relates to any number of logical progressions, let's say, or logical conclusions or any number of things that any number of people may feel comfortable saying. When I look at it, it has to do with the appropriate standard. When we look at the appropriate standard, to me, it has to do with there are things we cannot see. The person has to be able to say that first, and then there are things we cannot know. In that sense, though, if the person is talking about any number of topics, it has to do with that subject. But if we finally understand that, though, and say there are things we cannot see, then the person can talk about any particular topic related to any number of subjects and understand them regardless of where the subject lies in any number of discussions. If I talk about an angel, it's an unseen being, correct? If I talk about any topic, exactly. If I talk about something beyond, exactly. When we look at any number of appropriate topics, though, that was the standard that was given, but if the person talks about two standards, that also exists. But we have to be careful about that second standard, exactly. But we can evolve to that standard, exactly. But in that sense, though, if the person is talking about nearly any topic, though, it has to do with whether someone understands that. If a person is in a particular topic, though, when we talk about any number of subjects, we're talking about the unseen. But when persons are talking about any number of topics, though, it has to do with whether or not the person finally understands that. When someone is in any kind of standard, though, it has to do with any number of topics. So a person has to accept, though, that when a person is talking about any number of topics, a person can talk about things that sound a certain way, whatever that is, but when we do talk to rational and thoughtful people in that sense, then it really has to do with whether anyone wants to talk about topics that may frighten them or those type of things. Those are rational topics. So if a person says, when a person is in any kind of topic, someone can be frightened by anything. But what we tell people about any number of topics is that if a person feels fear, it has to do with things that are related to that. In that sense, though, let's say about the human being, there's any number of fearful topics about it. When we look at the human being, it's a very fearful topic. In that sense, there have to be some portions of the human being in that sense, right? But when we talk about a fearful topic, who cares about that? What we talk about is that God is supreme over everything, but what we say is that He has knowledge of the unseen. When we are in any kind of topic, the person says, wow, I didn't know this exactly. But most of it is that. When we talk about nearly any topic and a person is coming into contact with something, it has to do with whether they understand what that could be in its logical conclusion, whatever that is, exactly. Let's say someone sees a tiny portion of something. It could be something completely different when we take it to its logical conclusion, for example, right? Like, we'll say a being can be a tiny particle, and then exactly. Someone can find a little piece of skin and not know what it is, and then we look at the human being, exactly. But let's say when a person is in any kind of context, we're talking about a hypothetical context, exactly. A person can find something tiny that they may refer to in a number of ways, and it could be evidence of something completely different, though. But it's about taking something to its logical conclusion. A person may not like that particular example exactly, but the gist of what I'm trying to say is evident, though. Someone can find something small, exactly. But who knows what it's evidence of, exactly? All we can say is any number of topics. But if the person doesn't like that particular example, though, it must be because the example by itself, a number of things, and that kind of thing. But if the person talks about any particular topic, they can substitute their own example, exactly. But what I try to tell persons about a topic is, though, like, it doesn't have to do with things that I'm talking about in that sense, right? All I want a person to understand is something very basic. A person can see something very tiny, though, and it can be evidence of something completely different if we take it to its logical conclusion. A small thing can be any number of things, but in terms of anything, right? Like, a person can talk about it. In that sense, though, when we do talk about these topics, the standard has to be with what we can see, exactly. In that sense, though, it has to do with things that are in the unseen, exactly. Only God has knowledge of the unseen. Have a great time. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.